Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about random access memory, otherwise known as RAM. What is RAM? How does it work? What are the different types of RAM out there? How do you set it up? And how do you optimize your RAM for gaming and other high-performance workloads? So let's go ahead and get into it. First, let's go over how RAM works. The main thing to know about RAM is that it is volatile memory, which means it will only hold your data while your computer is turned on. If you were to compare it to something like a hard drive or an SSD, these are considered non-volatile, which means they can hold your data for many years. But RAM is extremely fast. We're talking nanoseconds versus a hard drive being measured in milliseconds. So it's significantly faster to read and write data from RAM than it is from a hard drive or SSD. That's why all of your running programs and data that you need quick access to lives in your RAM. Everything that's currently running on your computer, whether that's the operating system itself, a game you're playing, a web browser, all that stuff is stored in RAM. The way to think of it is that RAM sits right next to your CPU, and it works in conjunction with it. Your CPU will ask the RAM for some data. The RAM will grab that data and then send it to the CPU, where it can then process that data. Now that you know how it works, let's talk about what RAM is actually used for, and what the different types of RAM are. There are lots of different types of RAM. You have DRAM, which is dynamic RAM, SDRAM, which is static RAM, and then things like DDR, SDRAM, DDR2, DDR3, DDR4, DDR5. All those different types of RAM are really designed for specific use cases. For example, most of us are just going to be using our computers for basic things like browsing the web, using Microsoft Office and things like that. For those people, we're probably just going to be using desktop or laptop RAM, which is typically going to be DRAM. DRAM is cheap, reliable, and works well in most situations. However, for things like servers, workstations, and embedded systems, these are usually going to require higher performance and reliability. So these systems might use things like static RAM or error-correcting code RAM. For today, I'm mainly going to be focusing on the types of RAM that you would find in desktop and laptop computers. The first one we talked about was DRAM, which is dynamic RAM. This is the most common type of RAM that you'll find in desktop and laptop computers. However, this type of RAM needs to be constantly refreshed. But don't worry, your computer does this automatically and you don't have to do anything. However, it's good to know that DRAM needs to be refreshed every 64 milliseconds or so. This is done by the bank and row precharging. And all you have to know is that this type of RAM is commonly found in your desktop and laptop computers. Next up is SDRAM, which is static RAM. Static RAM is much faster than DRAM, but it's also much more expensive. Because of this higher price tag, you won't typically see SDRAM used in your standard desktop or laptop computer. Instead, SDRAM is used as cache memory for your CPU, because CPUs are super fast and they can read and write data from SDRAM very quickly. One thing to note about SDRAM is that it does not need to be refreshed like DRAM does. Moving on, we have DRAM. This is the type of RAM you'll almost always find in your desktop or laptop computer. DRAM stands for Double Data Rate, Synchronous Dynamic Random Access Memory. Don't worry, all you really need to know is that this is the most common type of RAM out there. Some of the generations of DRAM include DDR3, DDR4, and the newest DDR5. Of these three, DDR4 is the most common, and it's what you'll typically find in most newer computers. On average, DDR4 runs between 2,400 and 3,200 MHz, and it's compatible with both Intel and AMD processors. As far as the difference between DDR3, DDR4, and DDR5, the newest DDR5 is about twice as fast as DDR4, and it uses less power. DDR3 is the slowest of the bunch, and it's starting to get pretty old at this point. In fact, most newer motherboards won't even support DDR3. Another type of RAM that you might come across, especially if you're using a smartphone or tablet, is LPDDR. LPDDR stands for low power. These types of RAM are ideal for mobile devices where space and power consumption are at a premium. One of the most common types of LPDDR is LPDDR4X, and you can find this in a lot of modern smartphones. LPDDR5 is also starting to hit the market, and you'll find this in some of the newest phones and tablets. And finally, we have ECC RAM. ECC stands for error correcting code, and this type of RAM is designed to detect and correct any errors that might occur while reading, writing to the RAM. Usually you'll find this type of RAM in servers and workstations, where high availability and data integrity are very important. Now that you know the different types of RAM, let's talk about how to set it up in your computer. Setting up RAM is fairly simple, and if you're installing it in a desktop computer, it's actually very easy to do. However, if you're installing RAM in a laptop, it can be a little bit more challenging because laptops are smaller and they have less room to work with. The first step is to make sure you buy the right RAM, and that means checking your motherboard to see what type of RAM it supports. Most modern motherboards support either DDR4 or the newest DDR5. Before buying your RAM, you want to make sure that whatever you buy is compatible with your motherboard. Another thing you'll want to consider is the speed of your RAM. The speed is measured in megahertz, and you'll want to make sure that whatever RAM you buy matches or exceeds the minimum speed supported by your motherboard. For example, if your motherboard says it supports DRAM for RAM at 2133 MHz or higher, you can buy RAM that runs at 2133 MHz, 2400 MHz, 2666 MHz, and so on. Finally, you'll want to consider getting RAM that supports dual channel. This simply means you buy 2 sticks of RAM instead of just one. Having 2 sticks of RAM will almost always result in better performance than just having 1 stick. Okay, now that you have your RAM, let's talk about how to install it. First, of course, you'll want to make sure your computer is powered off and unplugged. Then open up your computer case and locate the RAM slots. Typically, the RAM slots are located close to the CPU, so they're pretty easy to find. Next, you'll want to unlock the clips that are on the RAM slots. This is usually done by pushing on the clips, and they should snap upwards. Then take your RAM stick and align the notch on the RAM stick with the notch in the RAM slot. Once they're aligned, press down on the RAM stick until you hear a click. This means the RAM stick has been properly installed. If you bought 2 sticks of RAM, repeat this process for the second stick. At this point, you can close up your computer case, plug it back in, and power it on. Once your computer turns on, you'll want to go into the BIOS to verify that it sees both RAM sticks and that they're running at the correct speed. To get into the BIOS, you'll usually have to press a key like Del or F2 as soon as you turn on your computer. Look for a message that says press Del to enter the setup. Alright, so once you get into the BIOS, you'll want to navigate to the memory settings and make sure everything looks good. If everything looks good, you can exit the BIOS and move on to the next step. Now that your computer is booted up, you'll want to verify that the RAM is showing up correctly in your operating system. In Windows, you can press the Control plus Shift plus Escape keys, and this will bring up the Performance tab in Task Manager. From here, you can see how much RAM you have installed, and it should match what you have physically in your computer. You can also run the Windows Memory Diagnostic tool to verify that your RAM is working okay. In Linux, you can run the command free-h or sudo dimidicode type memory to see how much RAM is installed. And on a Mac, you can go to the Apple menu, click About This Mac, and then click on Memory to see how much RAM is installed. Finally, let's talk about how to optimize RAM performance. One of the ways you can improve RAM performance is by enabling something called XMP, which stands for Intel Extreme Memory Profile. Essentially, this feature allows your RAM to run at the rated speed that you purchased it for. To enable this in the BIOS, navigate to the memory settings and look for a section that says XMP Profile. From here, you should be able to enable the profile that matches the speed of the RAM you purchased. Just make sure that the profile you select matches the speed of the RAM you're using. Otherwise, you could potentially damage your RAM or your computer. Alternatively, if you're using an AMD processor, you can enable something called DOC, which stands for Define on Chip Profile. This is similar to XMP, and it also allows your RAM to run at its rated speed. Another thing you can do to improve RAM performance is to adjust your virtual memory. Virtual memory is a feature in Windows that allows you to use a portion of your hard drive as RAM. Sometimes this can improve performance, especially if you're running low on physical RAM. To adjust your virtual memory in Windows, navigate to System and Security, then click on System, then click on Advanced System Settings, then go to the Advanced tab under Performance. Then click on Settings under Advanced, then go to the Data Execution Prevention tab, then click on Change Settings. From here, uncheck the Automatically Manage Paging File Size for all drives, and then select a custom size for each drive. For the minimum, put 12,000, and for the maximum, put 30,000. Once you're done, click OK and restart your computer. Finally, one last thing you can do to improve RAM performance is to close unnecessary background apps. Background apps can consume a significant amount of RAM, and this can slow down your computer. To close background apps in Windows, press the Control plus Shift plus Escape keys to bring up Task Manager, and then End Task for any app you don't need. And that's it. That's how to set up and optimize RAM by following these steps. You can ensure that your RAM is running at peak performance, and that will help improve the overall performance of your computer. Let me know if you guys have any questions about RAM, and I'll try to answer them in the comments below. Hopefully you learned something new, and if you did, please leave a like on the video. Also make sure to check out my other videos that I think you'll like. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.